Hello folks, my name is Jim Worthen. The show's Worthen One-on-One. We're here on Channel 17 Cox Cable in the south coast of Santa Barbara County every Monday at 2 o'clock, Wednesday at 5 o'clock, and Friday at 7 o'clock. But there are better, or it's good, outlets for our show, platforms we call them, because these go worldwide. One is TVSB website. You go to the demand button and they go all the way to, I've said this too much, I gotta quit saying it. You have to go all the way to the bottom of the shows to find Worthen One-on-One. And again, they say it's the alphabet, and I say, I know the alphabet, you don't have to put me last. And then you could go to YouTube and search Worthen One-on-One, and we're right there with this and other shows that you can share, because there's things that'll be said and stories that'll be told by this guest, but all my guests that pertain to people all over the country, all over the nation. My guest this evening is, I used to call him a friend, but the way he treats me, he's an acquaintance now, and he normally starts out when I ask about where people were born, but he threatened me, so I'll just say, you had wonderful people who you claim to be your parents, and they were, or I know of one and have continually met the other, your mother, and they give you a great history of things in the world. Robert Eringer, the investigator.
Hello, Jim. Nice to be back to see you again.
Do you mind telling the Holocaust type history of your parents, their grandparents, and their...
Well, I did a column on that recently. As your audience may know, I write a weekly Sunday column for the Santa Barbara News Press called The Investigator.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Most columns are in the view section. Your columns usually start on A2 and go on to other pages in the prime section of the news press.
Well, let's face it, it's not a column, it's a page. So I write a page, and it's called The Investigator. And I decided on, since I write on a Sunday, and Genocide Day is always on a Sunday, in April, I think it was April 24th, I wrote a column about genocide, and about the Armenian genocide that was committed by the Turks back in the late 1800s all the way through into World War I.
Both butchery and driving people into the desert just to die.
As the word genocide means, it was actually an attempted genocide because of it didn't succeed. They didn't kill all the Armenians like they would have presumably liked to have done, but they killed quite a few of them, maybe 3/4 of the Armenian population of Turkey.
Now that's your mother's heritage?
Yeah, it was my mother's side of the family.
Yeah,
yeah, her mother was Armenian.
Her mother came here from Armenia, right?
She did. She actually did not come here. She married a British Army officer who was stationed in a city called, then it was called Constantinople, and I remember her referring to it as Constance, and that city became Istanbul. Well,
but they didn't change the song. They still call it Constantinople in the song.
I don't know the song, but when my grandfather went there with the British Army, it was called Constantinople, and they were occupying. We were winning the war. We'd won the war, and they occupied what had been enemy territory.
Now that was the First World War, and they were aligned with Austria-Hungary and
That's
Germany.
Correct. That is correct. So they were there in Constance, and my grandmother, the story goes, worked in a gentleman's tie shop, that is knotted ties. And she was very beautiful, and many British Army officers bought more ties than they ever needed just to be able to go in and spend time with her, even though she could not speak any English, and not sure how much Turkish they spoke. My grandfather obviously won because I'm here today. He married her. Her family was very much opposed to a marriage because he was British. But she said she was going to be a nun if she could become a nun if she couldn't marry him, and they didn't, for whatever reason, didn't want her to become a nun. So they acquiesced, they got married. She learned English, and then they moved to Britain, to a town called Putney outside of London, where his family was unhappy because he had married an Armenian from Turkey. So wherever you looked, there was intolerance. That's the way the world was back then, hopefully much less so now.
Yeah, we put up with you. How about your dad?
Well, he comes from another attempted genocide. My father's father was born, you could say Poland or you could say Russia, but it was partitioned and changed sides so many times that you never really knew it was a gray area. They were from a small town.
Second World War.
Second World War. He left before that.
Okay.
We're talking about late 1800s into the early 1900s. They were from a little town called Wysoki, which is near the Russian border of Poland. And they emigrated to the United States through Ellis Island, settled in New York City in 1913. So when my father came along, 1924, he was born in New York, and that's that.
So both sides had seen, and you've written well about the two Holocausts.
I'll add to that, since I think that's what you were getting at, is that after my grandfather moved to New York, he created a travel agency. I think it was the Henry Eringer Travel Agency on Broome Street on the Lower East Side, which is where many of his compatriots settled, that part of Manhattan. And he saw what was happening and kept offering all of the relatives and friends back in Wysoki free passage. His travel agency was going to cover if only they would get out of there and come over to the United States. I think a few took him up on it. Most did not, because they thought they were doing well and they thought it would continue. And almost all of them perished in Auschwitz because of that second attempted genocide, the Holocaust.
Yeah. They were doing well till Kristallnacht. And
well, it changed everything.
Yeah.
Wysoki didn't have such a good time of it.
Yeah. So how did they meet?
Same situation, because my father was a GI in the U.S. Army, and he got drafted, I would guess, and at the age of probably 18 or 19, shipped over to Britain, where he was fortunate enough not to have to go to continental Europe, but because he was a draftsman, he was a graphic artist, so they put him into mapping, which was Army intelligence. So he got to stay on Green Street in Mayfair in London. And he met my mother. We went to a dance probably in Putney, where my mother lived, and met my mother. So I'm the product of 2 world wars and 2 attempted genocides and 2 GI brides.
So that's what made you into such a bastard, huh?
Well, I'm not sure. Well, no, my parents were very married when they had me.
Yeah.
I mean, you got to.
I was talking about personality.
Oh, well, I think that would be more attributed to you than I. But.
True. Now, where were you educated?
Mostly self-taught, but if you're talking about
formal,
forced education, I grew up in Beverly Hills. Not the fancy part. I grew up on what they call the flats, which were the little ranch houses around just north of Wilshire Boulevard. Went to Beverly Vista School, spent a year at Beverly High. Never liked school much at all. Had more fun just playing with all the kids on our block. And there were many to play with. Those were the good old days when kids actually went out after school and played. We had a great time, and then when we moved to London when I was 14 in 1969, and I ended up going to the American School in London, which was a fabulous experience, one of my favorite schools of all time. Graduated from there. Then you get into formal education after forced education. And formal education I dabbled with, oddly, in Cape Cod Community College in West Barnstable, Massachusetts. And after that, at American University in Washington, D.C. And after that, a master's program that USC was running in international relations out of the U.S. Navy building headquarters in London.
Now you went back to London for that.
No, my family had moved to London, and I pretty much, I would go to the States for short amounts of time to experiment with college. Much preferred London, and it would always end up coming back to London. And I was there all through the 70s.
Cute little story. Your dad continued as an artist, but your mother developed a new business in London that even as a 14 or 15-year-old you were helping with.
I had no choice. It was that or starve. Because what happened, my mother had an amazing cheesecake recipe at a time when no such thing as American cheesecake existed in London or anywhere in Britain, anywhere in Europe for that matter. They had a kind of a strange cheesecake with sultanas, which is a fancy raisin, as you may know, kind of Austrian style, but not what we know to be a classic cheesecake. And the Hard Rock Cafe opened in June of 1971. And on a lark, my father took down one of my mother's cheesecakes and ran into Isaac Tegret, who was one of the founders, owners of the Hard Rock Cafe. He and Peter Morton created the place. And Isaac took it away, and my father called 2 days later and said, well, what do you think? Would you like our cheesecake? And Isaac said, what cheesecake? Well, the staff had eaten it all, and he'd never even had a chance to try it. So my father ran down with another cheesecake, and Isaac called the next day and said, well, we'll have 5 tomorrow and 5 every day after that. And thus
she's
launched,
cooking it on the range.
Kitchens in Britain back then were about the size of bathrooms, small bathrooms. And so it was a tiny galley kitchen with a small oven that could bake only 2 cheesecakes at a time. So it would take my mother, after a few months of the business being built up by my father, who was chasing around London finding new customers, it would take my mother from 6 in the morning till 8 at night to bake all of the cheesecakes she needed. And I would come home from the American school in London to a living room filled with tables on which were dozens of cheesecakes. And if I wanted dinner that night, guess what was for dinner? Cheesecake. We subsisted on cheesecake for months. Anyway, that's that story.
So where did you get this bug of investigative journalism? What started that?
It was between Cape Cod Community College and American University. I was back in London, and I got really interested in something called the Bilderberg Group, which most people said didn't exist, and some people said, yeah, it was this international organization that rules the world from behind the scenes. So if you asked questions about it, you immediately got labeled a conspiracy theorist.
The old Rockefeller.
Well, David Rockefeller was one of its founding members, and Rothschilds were involved. Bankers, captains and kings of commerce, politicians, and media barons were its core members. And I got very interested in that, so that when I went to Washington, to American University, and this would be in September of 1975, I began investigating the Bilderberg Group. And I ended up doing it for a term paper for the International Politics. Dr. Abdul Saeed taught. He was a great teacher. He was a Sufi, an Islamic Sufi, which is the mystical part of Islam. He was a good professor, probably the only good one I knew of there. I investigated the Bilderberg Group, wrote a term paper on it, and then when I returned to London, I refashioned it as a magazine article and placed it with a British magazine that had just started up called Verdict, and they published it, and that got me started as an investigative reporter.
You sort of crashed one of the Bilderberg meetings, didn't you?
I did, yeah, because nobody even knew it existed back when I was researching and writing about it. It was this big hush-hush kind of secret. Now, they claim they're not secretive. They were secretive. They just claimed to be private, but they were secretive. They really didn't want the world to know. And the rule was, if you were in the media and you got invited to attend, you were not allowed to talk about it or write about it. William Buckley actually was invited and did, and he was never invited back again.
Yeah.
So this magazine article of mine was published, and that would have been in, I believe, November of 1976. And I forecast in that article that their next conference was due to be held in Torquay in Devon, southern coast of Britain, in, I believe it was at the end of April of 1977. So, about 6 months later. So I called and booked myself in the Imperial Hotel, where the Bilderbergers, as they call them, did as they usually do. They book out the whole hotel for a long weekend. And I made a booking for a few evenings before and got there. And what was interesting to me was there was a whole bunch of Fleet Street reporters, Fleet Street being the old British journalism road where all the newspapers were headquartered. And every single one of them was holding the magazine, which was rather obscure anyway, so that was a surprise. And they're all taking bets as to whether or not this was fantasy or reality.
Your article.
Yeah. Because they're really? David Rockefeller's going to show up and Henry Kissinger's going to show up? And they're all sitting around with their magazines waiting in the lobby. And all of a sudden they start showing up. And these reporters couldn't believe it. It's like, wow, yeah, this is really happening. This meeting is taking place here. And I could remember I was there myself in the lobby when David Rockefeller arrived late in the evening. I remember he arrived in a white Range Rover, probably flown into the private airport, or rather this small commercial airport. No, maybe it was private, in Exeter, which was nearby. And he looked like Columbo. Remember Peter Falk in Columbo, because he had his raincoat on. He looked kind of bedraggled, just flown over. And I can remember him walking in and being totally astonished that there were reporters and photographers with bulbs flashing. Those were the old days when you took a picture and a flash bulb went off. And it was like unbelievable that, wow, they had finally been discovered by the media. And they were actually covered because of it for the very first time by mainstream British media. So crashed it? I did. Here's what happened. The night after they moved all their stuff in, and I had one last night before I got kicked out of the hotel because they booked the whole place. And I stayed up late drinking Jack Daniels in the hotel bar, and they closed the bar. I went upstairs to my room, and I went down the back stairs all the way down to the basement. Nobody was there, and all their equipment was there, unguarded, unchecked. And I thought, well, this is pretty cool. And I just nosed around a little bit. And I ended up coming across their gavel, bang, bang. And it was this wooden gavel with a brass plate on it that said Bilderberg, engraved Bilderberg, Elsinore, 1969. I think Elsinore is somewhere in Denmark. I couldn't help myself. I admit it, I took it. I took the gavel. I left with it. And I got a little paranoid as well, so much so that I went out and I buried it a couple blocks away. So that the next morning when I had to check out of the hotel and go to a small bed and breakfast because I was going to stay around and cover the Bilderberg conference, which I did, I retrieved my gavel. And I remember a few years later going to London. A German magazine, Stern, hired me to go to London and cover the Bilderberg Steering Committee meeting. Steering Committee was their core group that decided the agenda for the upcoming conference and who to invite, participants. So I went there, and I was at the hotel where they were meeting, and dear old Mrs. Hugendorn, who ran the Bilderberg Secretariat out of The Hague in Holland. She had read my little book on Bilderberg, in which I explained that I had had their gavel. And she, at one point, walked up to me and smiled and said, "Naughty, naughty." So yeah, I crashed it.
Did you ever give back the gavel?
I still have it.
Wonderful.
Yeah. And I'm not selling it on eBay either.
It's probably worth a lot of money.
I don't know.
You, I believe, have attributed, if not in your columns, but privately to me, that this really, out of this group came the European Union, came the parts of NATO, the what we conservatives call the world government.
It did. It was born. European Union was born out of the Bilderberg meetings. That was their earliest mission at a time when they actually met with a mission in mind. They don't do that anymore. But when they first got off and running in the early 1950s, they actually got together, had a consensus of policy, and pursued it in their various spheres of influence. And their major policy back then was, at the earliest possible time, to have a European Union. And it started with the EEC, and it evolved over time into actual unified Europe. And also running a parallel line with that was the Atlantic Alliance. And this was all in opposition to the Soviet Union, because we're talking about the early 50s. Actually, we're talking about the late 40s when the movement first began, supported by the CIA, which incidentally also provided key money for the first Bilderberg meeting, because they needed to unify Europe and unify Europe with the United States against the Soviet Union. And that was the whole reason it was created.
Now, what was the title you used? We know it as NATO. It was
North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's a meeting every year in the woods north of San Francisco.
Bohemian Grove.
Bohemian Grove.
Often compared to Bilderberg, but a whole different deal.
Yeah, more social and drinking, but
Well,
powerful people.
yeah, I was saying how Bilderberg had changed. Bilderberg has become more like Bohemian Grove, not because they're camping out, because they're not. They're in a luxury hotel, but because it's really all about the backroom whispers and people making business deals and getting to know each other and so on. I call it the super networking. It's the networking of the power elite. Those who are mostly in power, they have power and they like to get to know each other and figure out ways where they can work together for mutual aims.
Now, is it the Bilderbergs or Bohemian Grove that you've attributed to the introduction of and picking presidential candidates in both parties?
No, they're different, because Bohemian Grove is where traditionally Republican candidates would reveal that they were going to run for president before they told anybody else. Reagan did that, Nixon did that, there were others as well. It just became a tradition for Republicans to announce it secretly first to their fraternity, Bohemian Grove members, and then go out and announce it to the public. Bilderberg differs because Bilderberg's steering committee has an eye for trying to choose up-and-coming politicians who they can groom into, hopefully, they think, into their way of thinking. And their way of thinking used to be called New World Order, which became synonymous with conspiracy theory, into globalism, which has actually become mainstream. It's not conspiracy theory anymore. They've come right out and said, yeah, we're globalists.
And they were more the introduction of Bill Clinton and more on the moderate Democrat right, Kennedy, Clinton, through the Bilderberg, where Bohemian Grove, you're saying, was more Republican.
I think they're fairly centrist in their thinking. They'll back Republicans and Democrats. They just want a backer. You could have David Rockefeller contributing to a Democratic candidate and a Republican candidate based on having gotten to know that politician at a Bilderberg conference. Okay. And they feel that, well, now we've rubbed shoulders with them, they know how we feel. They thought, mind you, now we're getting into the realm of the Trilateral Commission as well, which is actually an offshoot of the Bilderberg group. It was a way of incorporating the Japanese without actually inviting the Japanese to Bilderberg. That was the original idea. And then they decided, no, let's have a separate organization, and we'll call it based on the tripartite. You got North America, Western Europe, and Japan, because Japan had become an industrial powerhouse, and now they decided needed to be included in their thinking and their plans. That's how the Trilateral Commission got born. Jimmy Carter was one of its original members. They liked him. They thought in him they saw a globalist who would listen to them. Did Jimmy Carter listen to them? No, he didn't. I think he was playing them rather than the other way around.
Well, and that was post the American Caesar Douglas MacArthur reconstructing Japan.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
Now, we have a group in Santa Barbara, and I haven't heard any infiltration or any cross-pollination between Ranchos Visitadores and either one of these groups, except for the horsemen who, like Ronald Reagan, who want to go ride a horse. It's not politics.
No, the common denominator is Pendleton whiskey, bourbon. yeah, that's what they got in common.
Well, and back in the day, hookers, but that was many years ago.
I wrote a story about that too, Bohemian Grove, and it was really interesting because it was Ronald Reagan had just gotten elected, and he used to habitually go to Bohemian Grove, and so many politicians. Remember, Bohemian Grove was started as an artists' enclave. It was started by Mark Twain and Jack London. And what always happens is the artists create something really cool, and then the very wealthy take it over, the power elite.
And they bring in the politicians.
And it's like, oh, this is cool, we're hanging out with artists. And little by little, they push the artists out because the artists can't afford it anymore, the artists and writers. And all that's left is the very wealthy businessmen, bankers, and politicians. So that's what happened with Bohemian Grove, and Reagan used to go. And they had, up there you have the Guerneville River. I think it's near the town of Guerneville, and Monte Rio is the other town nearby. And they had a system, it was men only, Bohemian Grove, only men. And in fact, they had a real problem when women wanted to work there, and they wouldn't let women work there. I'm not sure how that got resolved. I think they do have female staff now because they wouldn't be able to get away with it at this day and age. But it was all male-oriented, certainly male-dominated. And they had a euphemism, and it was called jumping the river. And what jumping the river meant was leaving the encampment, crossing the Guerneville River, and going into town where a number of motels had filled up with prostitutes, mostly in from Nevada for the business. And they knew when to be there. It was 3 weeks, end of July into August, and they would go there. And I remember calling from the East Coast, a place called Northwood Lodge, which I believe is in Guerneville, and ended up talking to its manager, a man by the name of Manu Kanani. Okay? And Manu Kanani was very forthcoming. And he said, do you see any of the dignitaries from Bohemian? Oh, yeah. I said, well, who? And the Duke of Edinburgh was one of such person who, so he claimed, was one of those who jumped the river and enjoyed some of the delights of the local motels there. And I ended up writing a story for Globe, the tabloid, and it was a front page story, and the headline was Reagan in Sex Camp Rumpus.
Was he? He wasn't. He maybe could have been. Yeah, he was kind of a rounder in his youth.
I don't know. I don't know for sure.
Well, when I knew him, I never saw anything like that. But then Nancy had the short leash on Yeah.
Well, she wasn't around, was she?
Yeah.
Not in Bohemian Grove. That's why they didn't allow women around.
Yeah,
The
probably
boys
didn't allow him to go there anymore.
boys will be boys.
Yes. And so we're going to get to the Investigator and how that column started, and maybe before that, let's talk about the Iran-Contra and someone you became a partner with who was a top, probably second or third in command of the CIA.
Well, you're talking about Claire George, and Claire George was Deputy Director of Operations, which meant he was the head of the clandestine service of the agency. The covert side with does all the human intelligence and essentially the spy master, and it's usually the highest job a career CIA officer can aspire to.
He became involved with the head of national security, a young colonel, Ollie North, in what came to be known as Iran-Contra, or I think Ollie called it a wonderful idea.
Yeah, I don't think the CIA was so enamored with it. I know Claire George wasn't and got pushed into it. But Ollie North was coming from the White House, and he had Ronald Reagan's ear, and this is what they wanted done. And so Claire was kind of forced to go along with it and got himself implicated in Iran-Contra. And in the end, it pretty much cost him his job.
Yeah. He ended up resigning, and Ollie ended up being prosecuted. But it also was stimulated by Congress banning any aid to the Contras, the freedom fighters, and in fact, a lot of them fighting with indigenous people against the communists in Nicaragua.
Yeah.
And as I say, Ollie ended up getting prosecuted, being found guilty, and it being overturned in the courts.
Well, so was Claire. He was prosecuted for it, and in fact, the first time it was a hung jury, and but then the prosecution decided to go ahead and try a second time, and they did convict him. Actually, they didn't convict him. They found him guilty, but he was pardoned by President Bush before sentencing, which means he was never convicted.
And to be candid, they both were doing this with no more than one person removed directly by President Ronald Reagan.
Let's face it, Ronald Reagan knew what was going on, and Claire wouldn't give him up.
Yeah.
It was simple as that. I mean, they're both gone now, so the truth can be told.
You're kinder. You say he knew. I believe he directed it.
Well, I don't know that he directed it, but Claire was never the kind of person who would give anybody up, and he fell on a sword.
Well, let's jump, because we'll pick up some of the other stories, to the Investigator. When I first knew of you, you had a column, I thought it was on Saturday, every couple of weeks in the news press for just a few months, and it disappeared.
It was about 9 months, and it was every Saturday.
Yeah.
And it was on a Saturday, and it was typical column. That one was about 800 to 1,000 words.
And I followed I think it was 4-part series on our police chief, Sanchez, and he resigned by the time you were done.
Well, I don't know. Okay, he kept going for a few years longer after my story about him, and in fact, I stopped writing for the news press when the editor wouldn't publish my second story on Sanchez, which was extremely well investigated and proven. One of my sources was Sanchez's own brother-in-law, and there were some very serious allegations made that seemed to be true.
Was that the use of police vehicles? And
No. That was in my first column. The second one dealt with some other stuff Sanchez had been doing. It was suggested elder abuse, taking advantage of family money, that kind of thing.
Yeah, there was a confrontation up on Cliff Drive at Shoreline Park, really.
That's really what opened. That was the first story.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was one.
So,
And it was an abuse of power story that was going to lead elsewhere, but it didn't. And he ended up remaining as chief for a few more years.
So you quit that, and about 2 years ago, some people encouraged you to go back and reinstitute this. I don't know who those people are. Do you?
Memory issues, you know. But
I know one of them very well, Jimmy Olsen.
That's right, Jimmy Olsen.
And the current owners of the News Press, who were they the owners?
Yes.
Or they just become owners, and they were in quite a battle with the Teamsters over.
That happened before I started writing the first Investigator column for them. They'd gone through that tumultuous period where, they own a newspaper, and they didn't want to be told that they couldn't have some influence. I don't really want to get involved in what their fight was. It doesn't matter to me. The politics of the paper also matters not to me. I do my own thing, and I do it very autonomously. I have no contact with the newsroom aside from the editor, and that's just because I send him the column every week. And then it surprises the hell out of me when I go down on a Sunday with my quarters to get a copy, and they've actually published it.
Yeah, no, they show great respect for you, and are as delighted each Sunday. I'm talking about the publishers, which I have an acquaintance with. They frequently on Sunday morning, there's emails or texts between me and one of the publishers, and me and you and me, and about, did you see this? Starting at about 7 in the morning, we get it.
Wow. Okay.
Delivered.
Cool. I didn't know.
Yeah.
Very sweet.
So let's talk about. We could go with the Klan. You wrote about it. You have told several stories. Many of your exposés are strictly local, and you've been involved in the COVID controversy and big pharma, but some of them are stories told out of your book Ruse and out of your other writings. One came out just about a Chinese guy. He wasn't really Chinese, was he?
He wasn't Chinese.
And I had never seen it. I've read much of your stuff. I even got to be in a little bit of one book called Montecito Madness, and I was one of the maddest people in that book. So this was Ming?
Yeah, it was the column was called The Ming Sting, and it was a sting operation that I did when I was working for Prince Albert of Monaco. But to provide a little context about, since you're talking about the column and how that works local, the idea, certainly at the beginning, was to focus on local investigations. The only problem with that is it's just me. I do everything myself, and newspapers hardly do investigative reporting anymore. Why? Because it's expensive. That's number one. Number two is it's potentially litigious, and we live in a highly litigious society and culture. So newspapers have tended to shy away from it. Local stories are probably more dangerous than the big international ones, because you're dealing with people who have perhaps something to lose, and if you defame them in some way, then anybody can file a lawsuit against anybody for any reason in this country, and then you got to fight it, and we know what that's like because the legal system is expensive. So consequently, I'm very careful with my investigative stories, local investigative stories. Everything's got to be just so, not just for me, but for the editor of the newspaper as well, who's also very careful about these things. which means I need to write about some other things as well if I'm going to produce a column every Sunday. So
originally, though, we had a fear that it wasn't that way, that everything had to be local.
yeah,
and I remember
what we were
that-
going to do, we talked about it, we were going to do every other Sunday. But what I felt was, if you don't have that page in there every Sunday, then you're losing a continuity. And so I felt it was really important for the reader for it to be a regular staple on a Sunday.
I think once you called me and said, well, this is a test about local. I've said in a column, I'm dying to see if they print it. And since then, maybe half of your columns haven't been.
It's opened up. I went to, I did a story because I went to London, and so and that was in November, and I did a kind of a letter from London, which they restyled as Our Man in London. And it was really some fun, quirky, newsworthy stories I'd picked up while I was in London, looking up all my old friends and sources. I thought they liked it too, obviously. It was a really long column, maybe one of the longest ones. And then a month later, I happened to be in Washington, D.C., and did the same thing. Letter from Washington, and they restyled it as Our Man in Washington. And that was cute, and I enjoyed that. And what I've since
Now, you
been
say
doing,
restyle. You're not talking. They
or
don't
just
edit
rephrasing it,
Yeah.
giving it another moniker. So what I've done lately, because the editor seems to like these kinds of columns, is I go back into my background in intelligence and espionage, and I write a column page-size story on a particular operation, mission, adventure that I had. And it's fun reading. And I've had a lot of good feedback from people
For those who
on those kinds of columns.
For those
So
who-
it's a mix now.
Yeah.
I go back, there's a whole mix of different things.
For those who didn't buy Ruse and read it,
Yeah.
but I even, although I did, 10, 15 years ago, it brings back great memories. Now, let's talk about the one that didn't get in, Ming.
Well, Ming wasn't an FBI. The Ruse was about my undercover missions for FBI counterintelligence specifically. Ming falls under the auspices of the work I did in Monaco for Prince Albert. I created for him the Monaco Intelligence Service, and one of the first targets we developed was against an American, a retired Air Force colonel who we believed was spying for the Russians, and that we believed that he had been recruited a couple of decades earlier, and we wanted to find out more. So since my
Now,
specialty,
was he in Monaco?
I did not see him ever in Monaco. He had a residence at that time in Monaco, and had had one for a number of years. But I saw him here in California, where he had a house in Malibu, and also in London, where he had a really nice flat, they call a flat, an apartment in London. And I endeavored, my specialty in investigative journalism, especially in London, and in doing intelligence work, especially for FBI counterintelligence, was staying undercover. That is infiltration, penetrating your target with the specific purpose of gaining information or perhaps leading to some other operational objective. So I decided that I would do that myself, even though I was running this service for Prince Albert. I endeavored to penetrate this retired colonel's existence. And I did that, and he was very forthcoming, told me all kinds of things that, you know, when you get people talking, they like to build themselves up. And they and give them room, and they'll do themselves in. Especially if that's what you're there for, to try to get them to do themselves in.
In the FBI and in your other operations, you frequently use the ability to help somebody write a book, an editor for a company. What was the sting with this guy?
It wasn't what I call the book model, and that's absolutely right. I used it effectively a number of times in a number of situations. With him, a cold call. And you just have to do your research because you only get one shot with a cold call. And I was able to drop Monaco's. I had experience with Monaco. I could talk about it authoritatively, and that I'd come across him, and he would be complimented that I would have come across his name, and that I thought it would be a good idea if we can get together and talk about.
He didn't know you were working for Prince Albert.
He did not know I was working for Prince Albert. Only that I was a consultant, and I was partly based in Monaco. Knew it well, and it rang his bell. So he came up and met me at the Biltmore Hotel. We had martinis. He had 3. And by the time we were done, after about an hour and a half of talking, he thought that our relationship had been designed by the stars and insisted on giving me a hug. Well, this is what you want to do in Sting Undercover. You want somebody to like you so much that they believe that you are their new best friend.
Oh, disclaimer, we've never hugged, never. Go ahead.
Very next day, I went to his place in Malibu. He invited me because we had something in common. We both knew a professor from Georgetown University. He, because he'd gone to Georgetown and taken Carroll Quigley's Western Civilization course. And I, because when I was at American University and I was researching Bilderberg, Carroll Quigley was like the power elite guy. He knew about this stuff. So he was at Georgetown, I was at American University, but he agreed to see me. And he realized in me was a real student, somebody who really wanted to learn stuff. So I saw him kind of regularly, and he'd send me out of his office with books in brown paper bags because he didn't want to see his colleagues. He didn't want his colleagues to see him giving somebody those kinds of books.
Giving you
Carroll Quigley,
the
professor.
Yeah.
He would give me books that were mind-blowing, that nobody's ever heard of now, but Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. Okay, how the Bolshevik Revolution was actually financed by Wall Street. Now I suppose it's pretty accepted.
And the New York
Back in
Times.
the 70s, conspiracy theory. What's amazing is so many things that were considered conspiracy theories in the 1970s are now considered mainstream. But people don't care. What? People don't read. And I think the powers that be realize that, and it doesn't matter anymore. They've got young people, the newer generation, so addicted to social media, stupid stuff. What picture am I going to put on Instagram? Where should I go tonight? Just because I want to put a picture of me there on Instagram so that all my so-called friends think I'm something. The whole thing's ludicrous.
So I can take it, and maybe you can tell me why, that you've never been canceled on Twitter or Facebook or.
Well, I'm not on them.
Oh, that's a way to not get canceled.
Yeah, I'm not on them. I don't like social media. In fact, I call it anti-social media because that's what it truly is. And I went to Silicon Valley at a time when I had a blog, and the blog was taken down because it was a little controversial. And I went to talk to somebody. Nobody will talk to you. Facebook and Google are the most anti-social places in the world. Well, I'm sure there's more, North Korea, Russia. But in this country, you go there, you try to talk to somebody, nobody can talk to you. Well, but I have an issue here. Oh, well, you have to, here, we'll write it down for you. support@google.com. support@facebook.com. Well, if you write support, if you send an email, you never hear back anything from anyone. The whole thing's a con.
Now I remember a picture in your blog that I thought was the most important part of your blog, and that was a garage where 2 young guys started a business, a guy named Packard.
Hewlett and Packard.
Yeah.
That's where the devil got reborn. You've heard of born-again Christians. This was born-again Satanism, where computers got started. And they'll do us in the end because it's just pure evil.
You've done a column on that. You really?
I did. I did a column on artificial intelligence. And I agree with Elon Musk. Better be very careful here because maybe that's why the universe put us here. So we were a tool to create artificial intelligence, which will ultimately get rid of us.
The Hewlett Packard.
Hewlett.
Yeah.
Hewlett.
Hewlett Packard.
Hewlett. Not Hewlett
Packard.
Hewlett Packard.
You're going to correct me, aren't you?
I'm always correcting you,
Yeah,
Jim.
I need it too. Our friend Robert Felly translates to people, my language.
I see.
Yeah, and it calls it speaking Worthen. You say, and you've written a column in the Investigator about this threat of AI, and was that the same column when you carried it out to the threat of nuclear holocaust and nuclear war? Or was that in a separate one about Putin?
No, that was separate. That was about Putin. Early days of his brutal invasion into Ukraine. And I thought it was a real possibility, and I continue to think so, especially lately. The Russians have made their thoughts known on our country sending long-range missiles into Ukraine, missiles that presumably could be used by the Ukrainians to send and strike Russian targets. Well, I actually think if Russians can strike the Ukrainians, it should be the other way around as fair game.
Yeah.
However, the way the Russians see this is, yes, that's fine, but if they're doing it with your weapons, we're at war. And if we're at war, anything can happen. That's their point.
Yeah. How do you feel about the way the Russian army has performed against the Ukrainian?
It's a joke. They're a joke, and it's partly because of the rampant corruption in Russia that starts at the very top with Putin squirreling about $200 billion away and building palaces for himself all over the place and buying the largest luxury yachts in the world, super yachts.
Okay.
But it trickles down to all of his cronies, and it trickles down into the military. So the Russian government thinks they're giving money for their tanks and other armored weaponry, but the generals and even the ranks below them are siphoning money, so very little is being spent to maintain their army. And consequently, it turned into a joke, and they got slaughtered in the Ukraine, which of course is a good thing because they have no reason being there to begin with.
I haven't asked you this. Do you think our military has been degenerated not by money but by wonkism about political correctness, pronouns, how many lesbians we're going to have in it?
I don't think so. I think it's a social and a media distraction, but I don't think Biden's in charge of anything much, including his own brain, but the military is still in charge, and I'm sure that they converse with their counterparts in Russia and basically lay the law down and say, don't think for one moment you're going to send any kind of nuclear weapon anywhere, and there isn't going to be a massive response to it. So we have a machine. The United States is a machine, and most of the time it's a sleeping tiger. But when you awaken that machine, as they did with 9/11, then there's hell to pay.
Yeah, I've said, and I'd like your opinion on it, we talk about this generation wouldn't rise up like the First World War, Second World War, even 9/11. And I'm saying don't test the American spirit's there. And if we were attacked, all these wonky young, I don't know my protein guys would be there fighting.
I don't think it matters that much. I don't even believe in troops on the ground because I think any major war is going to be fought through robotics. And if you have the technological know-how to strike and you don't need human lives put at stake and boots on the ground, then that should be avoided.
We're just going to need...
What do we want to do? Sacrifice another generation?
No. I tend to agree that the next most terrifying weapon in the next war is probably going to be drones. Yeah.
It should be, if there is going to be a war, I hope there isn't, but it shouldn't be humans in boots on the ground getting slaughtered. As war, as everybody knows, there's no honor. It's all very ugly.
Will you ever do an investigative report on China?
That's a good idea, actually. I mean, I don't tend to think about international subjects because the paper would prefer me to stay as close to home as possible. But I think a serious conflict with China is coming. I mean, it's clear. I'm not the only one who realizes that. All you got to do is watch the news. It's over Taiwan, and it's coming.
Yeah, they just announced today, the Chinese government, that they are going to reunify with Taiwan by 2027.
Well, I didn't see that.
I think what's happened to the Russians has pushed off their. They're not ready to fight even the Taiwanese.
You know, it may not be that. The Chinese are much more patient. Americans want everything instantly. We're just used to that kind of, that's our culture. The Chinese, being perhaps a more intelligent race, tend to understand the value of patience. And they're in no hurry.
Yeah.
They bide their time and collect all the intelligence they possibly can, and they're very good at it.
You want to give us a hint of the next couple of columns here in the last 2 minutes?
No, because I never talk about future
that.
columns. No.
I beg you.
No.
Sometimes we occasionally have a drink together. The last time you even bought pizza, and but I can't ever get out of you anything that's coming up in the column, and I can't even get out of you if any idea I had ever is going to be in the column.
Well, I like the idea. That it pleases me that I can cover various things so that nobody who follows the column and reads it has any sense of what's going to happen next, what they're going to read on Sunday. And I get a lot of very positive feedback from it, just being out and about in Montecito and downtown Santa Barbara.
I hate to do this in the last minute and a half plus because you hate talking about yourself. Tell me about your grandchildren.
They're great. They're fabulous. One's 10, one's 9, and they've grown up practically like twins. They're each with a different mother, but they're as close as can be. Fabulous boys, grown up well. Yeah, very proud of them.
And your daughter Claire and her husband Marcus are very involved, and so is Olivia, and of course Beth. And
Marcus owns a hair salon in Montecito, in case anybody's wants to improve their looks. That's the place to do it. Called Halo and Horns. Halo and Horns on Coast Village Road.
Hey. And the concept of you ever running for office, would you respond to that?
Why would I? What's the point? Yeah. I don't really care for politicians much. Why would I want to be one?
Well, and you have more influence than many politicians.
Well, I don't know if that's true, but it doesn't matter to me. I like doing what I do.
Well, as Roy Rogers would say, till we meet again.
All right. That was fun. Cheers.